morning. Welcome back. I am Jenna Storey, Senior Fellow in Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and Research Professor at Furman University, as well as a guest of the Madison program in 2016-2017. I want to take a second to explain that last designation because actually it was my husband who was named a fellow that year in 2016-2017. And the children and I were basically tagging along up here to Princeton. But one day early in the fall, I came to a coffee, and Robbie asked me to introduce myself. I said something about my background, about the work that I was planning to do during that year. And he said to me, Jenna, here in the James Madison program, we have a traditional view of marriage. And I'm sure I paled. My heart dropped. I thought of crawling back home. And then he said, marriage. What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours. Welcome to the Madison program. And I tell that story this morning because I think it's characteristic of the open-handed generosity that Robbie has shown to so many of us over the course of his long career. It's a remarkable virtue to find in anyone, I think, but even more so in someone who's dedicated his life to fighting against the distortions he finds in the institutions and in the vocation that he loves. Many people in that position are tempted to winnow down their allies to a weary few. But under Robbie's big tent, more and more of us gather together joyfully every year. So when some say that Robbie is like, when some say that Robbie is like a general, I can see why, but I think of him more as a patriarch, trying to build or maybe rebuild a culture and ready to bestow his blessing on anyone who is willing to play a part. Shiloh said yesterday that Robbie, Brad, and the Madison program have touched the lives of everyone in this room, and that's certainly true for me and my family. So I wanted to take this occasion to once again thank Robbie, Brad, the Madison program, and everyone involved in it for the many blessings that they have bestowed upon all of us. So this morning's panel asked the question, was the American Revolution too radical? And I think whoever posed the question for this panel was probably taking a friendly poke at our distinguished guest of honor, Gordon Wood, who in 1991 seemed to have already answered that question in his book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which was mentioned a couple times yesterday. So I'm supposing that our panelists will touch on some of the other themes from yesterday as well, such as whether the American Revolution was or wasn't too radical in terms of the creed it articulated and promulgated, or in terms of the social energies it unleashed or didn't well enough constrain. I hope they might also answer the question, if the American Revolution was indeed too radical, what do we do about that now? How does our judgment about that question shape the way that we face the challenges that our country currently encounters? We have today three eminent scholars here to address the question this morning, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will present. First, we have Jim Hankins, longtime professor of history at Harvard University. Jim is the author or editor of more than 30 books and 200 articles. And one of his most recent books, published in 2019 by Harvard University Press, which is called Virtue Politics, Soulcraft, and Statecraft in Renaissance Italy, won the Helen and Howard Mararo Prize of the American Historical Association, as well as the Times Literary Supplement's Best Book of the Year award in 2020. I noticed that Jim has a new book out just this spring, also from Harvard University Press. It's called Political Meritocracy in Renaissance Italy, and you can find it on the table outside in the lobby. You can also find Jim's essays and opinion pieces, which are always deeply thoughtful and beautifully written to boot, in popular outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, First Things, Law and Liberties, and Witherspoon's Public Discourse. Next, we'll hear from Paul Rahe, who holds the Charles O. Lee and Louise K. Lee Chair in Western Heritage at Hillsdale College, and the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow in Classics position at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Paul was a Rhodes Scholar and studied history with Donald Kagan at Yale, finishing both his BA and PhD in that institution. Paul has written a number of books on topics such as republics, ancient and modern, on Montesquieu's Logic of Liberty, and on soft despotism, which he calls Democracy's Drift. In recent years, he has been writing books on the evolving grand strategy of ancient Sparta. And for these efforts, Paul has been recently honored by the University of Piraeus in Greece with the Themistocles Statesmanship Award. Finally, we'll hear from Darren Staloff, who recently retired from his post as professor of early American history at the City College of New York and the Graduate Center of City University of New York. Darren is indeed a New York man through and through, having taken both his BA and his PhD from Columbia University before doing postdoctoral work as a National Endowment of the Humanities Scholar at the Omohundro Institute for Early American History and Culture. He is the author of 2 books, The Making of an American Thinking Class, Intellectuals and Intelligentsia in Puritan Massachusetts, and Hamilton, Adams, and Jefferson, The Politics of Enlightenment and the American Founding. Although you can sadly no longer hear Darren lecture in his City College classroom, you can listen to him talk about American history and the history of philosophy in several series put out by the Teaching Company. He's also working on a multi-volume treatment of the Enlightenment in America. So please join me in welcoming our panelists this morning.
Okay, well, I want to express my gratitude as well to the Madison program, to Rahe and Brad, for having me here this year. It's been a wonderful year. I've been working on a new history of Western civilization in my ongoing quest to be canceled at Harvard. So this may finally do it. Alan and I have been friends for over 50 years. We went to high school together. So we've had these lovely jaws, as he calls them, every week. And we talk about our project, although it's somewhat difficult considering that Alan writes about 3 times faster than I do. So I've written 120,000 words this year. Alan writes 20,000 words every 2 weeks. So we're at some point this summer going to have to get it together. Anyway, so I'm also grateful for the Madison program to discussing the past and future of American historiography, and also to celebrate the work of the distinguished American historian Gordon Wood. This session in particular is designed to consider what is for me his most important book, or at least most interesting for my purposes, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. This is a book I've long admired as a model of intellectual history, and I've taught it before in the undergraduate seminar on republics and republicanism, and I taught with Harvey Mansfield for a decade or so. You can see I have my old, well-thumbed and annotated copy with me, which I may read from if there's time. Anyway, the book is, I think, also, although it's published in 1991, is newly relevant to our present moment, since the radicalism of the American Revolution and the American founding in general has become newly contentious, both among progressives and conservatives. As Wood noted already in his book, the American Revolution has long been blamed by progressives for not being radical enough. Its inspiring ideals of liberty and equality weren't immediately applied to grant women full equality. Imagine that. Slavery was not immediately abolished, and this failure set the agenda for political conflict, civil war, and social upheaval for the next century and more. The revolution for the progressives wasn't radical enough, and this required Americans to make moral and political progress. Today, by contrast, the left's critique of the revolution sees it as a fraud rather than a temporary failure. The radical left today holds that the revolution's failure to be sufficiently radical utterly discredits it and exposes its hypocrisy and bad faith. It claims that the ideals of the founders were always a sham, that we're really a nation founded from the beginning on slavery and oppression. The ideals of the American founding were simply a lie, a smokescreen to disguise the fact that the revolt against England was in reality a war fought to preserve slavery. The fact that this interpretation is demonstrably false has not prevented it from being widely taught in American high schools and colleges, such as the perversity of our age. On the other side of the political spectrum, some conservatives in our country today, whom we can label broadly as post-liberal, blame the American Revolution for being too radical. There are various strands of post-liberalism, of which I would mention two: integralism, sometimes known as common good constitutionalism. Common good constitutionalism is Adrian Vermeule's term. It's a movement primarily among socially conservative Catholics. And then there's also national conservatism, described on the website of the movement as a project of the Edmund Burke Foundation. The main institutional base of national conservatism seems now to be the Heritage Foundation, under the leadership of Kevin Roberts, a self-described Burkean, very impressive guy. The major intellectual influence, I think, is Yoram Hazony, a Princeton man, who describes Edmund Burke approvingly as the anti-liberal par excellence and a defender of tradition in the British Constitution. So the American Revolution is blamed by both brands of post-liberalism for being too radical, and the blame is explicit in the case of the integralists, but only implicit with national conservatives. So let me start with them so I can bring out the implicit critique of the American founding, or at least the radical egalitarianism that came out of the American founding. National conservatives trace their intellectual lineage to Edmund Burke. They're post-liberal in the sense that they oppose, quote, a global rules-based liberal order, and they aspire to create, quote, an intellectually serious alternative to the excesses of purist libertarianism. Carefully chosen words. These are from the website. They're quick to stipulate that they revere the ideals of the Constitution, yet it seems unlikely that Burke himself would have approved of the radically egalitarian direction taken by the children of the Revolution. This is a serious problem if we accept with Gordon Wood that this egalitarianism was the natural and inevitable outcome of the Revolution's ideals. Burke himself, of course, had a positive horror of egalitarian ideals in the French Revolution. As his recent biographer, Richard Burke, there's another Burke, it's confusing, Richard, I pronounce it Bork, just to not get him too confused, but he pronounced it Burke. So Richard Burke has explained, Edmund Burke praised his own British nation as a country that, unlike the French, has succeeded in engrafting a dynamic commercial society onto a feudal system of rank and privilege. Edmund Burke sought to explain why the resentment, jealousy, and fear of oppression that had powered the democratic spirit in the French Revolution had, or so he hoped, failed in Britain. Burke makes no claim about the superior virtue of British aristocrats, but rather dwells on the emotions aroused by British history and traditions. He has an almost aesthetic appreciation for the social order that led the British to accept distinctions, even when holders of rank were less admirable men and women. All complex societies will have forms of dependence, he assumes, but successful societies moderate their forms of dependence by recognizing the moral equality of all persons. In place of illiberal forms of subjection, like slavery, they substitute a civilized relationship of deference and care that recognizes the mutual dependence of high and low. So for Burke, the solution to oppression is not personal autonomy. It's not an egalitarian dissolution of the social order, but rather forming certain moral attitudes on the part of superior and inferior classes in society. Attitudes such as deference to rank and recognition of what is due to the male and female sexes were, according to Burke, generous, by which he means gentlemanly, generosus. They were the product of liberal manners and enlarged views, these are his words, that accepted the unequal distribution of property and status as necessary for the common good and social harmony. A noble equality, again his term, could be preserved through all the distinctions of social rank by recognizing the value of all participants to the social whole. Now quoting, authority is made gentle and submission freely given when haughtiness and servility are tempered by civilized manners, restraint, and due deference. Unquote. So the best political society is one that balanced tradition and change, loyalty to the nation with practical needed reforms. Now, these reviews I submit have very little in common with the kind of egalitarianism that was described by Wood in radicalism. By contrast, the integralists or common good constitutionalists have mounted a wide-ranging, explicit critique of the American founding and its philosophical sources. For Patrick Deneen, the group's leading political theorist, the American founding was based on a false individualistic anthropology coming out of Locke, and therefore led to a false idea of liberty, a false idea eventually brought to overly fruity fruition by J.S. Mills, one of Deneen's bête noirs. Integralists argue more broadly that the American experiment was inherently unstable. It was an open-ended social experiment that tended to ever more liberalism and ever more individualism. The founding licensed a complete separation between political power on the one hand and economic power and social norms on the other. Integralists hold that the economy and social norms should be subordinate to political power and regulated by judicial authority. In this way, society as a whole can be oriented towards the common good and social solidarity restored. The kind of freedom that licenses individuals to practice radical and destructive social norms of their own choosing and to corrupt the traditions and settled ways of life of others is a false freedom. It's too radical a liberty. It's the false liberty of the political left. This is integralist. But there is also an equally destructive, unpolitical liberty of the neoliberal right. I can't remember whether Deneen uses that term neoliberal, which is a term of hate on the left, but I think he means that. He means the unpolitical liberalism of the market. He thinks that he and the other integralists, including my PhD student, Glenn Papin, have been particularly, think that this type of liberalism has been particularly harmful in the sphere of religion. The American religious radicals, after the founding, created a form of religious life, denominationalism, inherently unable to support the state and to strengthen moral order in society. That had been the traditional role of established religions, but it was fatally undermined by the prohibition on established religion contained in the Bill of Rights. Of course, the scholars know the states were not prohibited from establishing their own religions by the First Amendment, but the evolving understanding of the amendment eventually established a wall of separation between church and state that, according to the integralists, I think this is true, that empowered secularism and led to the undermining of American religion, the chief bulwark of our common traditions and morality. American evangelical Protestantism and other forms of egalitarian religion, whose emergence is illuminatingly discussed in chapter of Gordon Wood's book, wonderful chapter, from the integralist point of view, represents a surrender of church to state. I better read this. So there had been, to be sure, attempts throughout American history to bolster positive ideals by creating a civic religion out of generic, non-dogmatic forms of Protestant Christianity. I think the latest proponent of this has been the communitarians in the 90s. Robert Bella, I think, wrote the classic article on civic religion. But these, according to the integralists, hadn't been effective. Integralists hold that if government is to frame and enforce a stable moral order, as it should and must do, it has to be backed by real religion, rooted in actual faith of the people, not some construct of politicians and professors. You can start to see why they use this term integralism. It's borrowed from French political theory, integralism, early 20th century, which is an argument for the monarchy and the established monarchy and the church to work together. Okay, so this is, I think, why they're using common good constitutionalism lately. It's a less controversial name. But I think the integralists have a point. Politics abhors an ideological vacuum. After the 1950s, the progressive left, which had long hated traditional Christianity as backward and an obstacle to their aspirations for radical change, was largely successful, mostly via control of public education and high culture, in dissolving loyalty to dogmatic traditions among the pew-sitters of mainstream American denominations. After a period of normless and gormless radical freedom in the 1960s and 70s, radical progressives have now harnessed the resources of cultural Marxism to produce their own religious faith, a brew of social justice theory, identity politics, post-colonialism, and gender ideology. All of these articles of wokist faith can be seen as applications of radical egalitarianism, the belief that all established hierarchies are inherently unjust, the product of white supremacy. With the help of French theorists of social constructivism, they radicalized the American revolutionary belief that all distinctions between persons are artificial. The sole hierarchy that they approve of is that between the enlightened and the benighted, to use Thomas Sowell's terms. But the ultimate goal of hyper-egalitarian politics is to abolish even that hierarchy, too, by converting and uniting and turning the benighted towards the shining path that leads to an egalitarian utopia. In recent years, DEI regimes have been using all the tools of 17th century established churches, including catechisms in the form of mandatory sensitivity training, a loyalty oath in the form of required adherence to mission statements, suppression of free speech, censorship, informers, surveillance, and punishment to enforce public and private acknowledgement of their neo-racist and radically anti-traditionalist credo. So this illiberal tendency of radical progressivism, radical egalitarianism, points to some of my own misgivings about the radicalism of the founding generation. I have more admiration than do the integralists for the ordered liberty the designers of the Constitution tried to create, something I take to be inspired as much by Montesquieu's praise of moderate government as by the individualist anthropology of Locke. I have considerable sympathy with national conservatism and its defense of American traditions, and that's why I have misgivings about the radicalism of the American Revolution, the historical phenomenon, not the book. The book is, is incredibly useful book. And if you haven't read this, you really should, because it explains so much about America. Anyway, my misgivings concern the unstable form of egalitarianism that emerges from the founding, revolution and attitudes that Gordon Wood describes as originating in hostility to the values of the older hierarchically based monarchical society, above all kinship, patriarchy, and patronage. According to Wood, American egalitarians of the founding wanted to replace monarchical old think with new social bonds of love, universal benevolence, respect, and consent, and to base government on virtue and disinterested public leadership rather than inherited rank or loyalty to British tradition. So just to quote Wood, equality was in fact the most radical and most powerful ideological force let loose in the Revolution. It became what Herman Melville called, now he's quoting Melville, the great God absolute, the center and circumference of all democracy. That's egalitarianism. So my misgivings about this radical egalitarianism, which I admit in some ways is admirable, was certainly better suited to American society of the early 19th century than some kind of monarchicalism. My reservations is mostly to do with the ism in radicalism. As we know, the ism is a suffix from the Greek suffix idzein, meaning implying change in process. And this suffix is rarely attached to adjectives before the 19th century. I once attended a lecture where a political theorist was arguing that the word isms had never been attached to any words before the 19th century, somewhat overstatement. So a little voice in the back, which turned out to be Arnaldo Emiliano, said, "Baptism." And has spoiled that argument, but it is true that that these isms are become multiplied in the early 19th century, and they indicate process and a project. So liberalism is the process and project of becoming more liberal. The German historian Droysen invented the term Hellenistic for a Hellenistic period, meaning the period in which the Eastern Mediterranean became more Hellenic, more Greek. Communism the same way, it's a process. So radicalism is a process and a project of becoming more radical. There's something about the American form of egalitarianism that lends itself to becoming a political movement and galvanizes an open-ended process of social change, and a process that's rather hard to stop at a moderate moment. As a movement, it acquires something of the physiognomy of religious revivalism, When egalitarians of this new American kind fail to get their way, following the commands of their great God absolute, they can and do undermine and subvert the liberal, moderate, prudent forms of government that for me are the most valuable parts of the American political tradition, especially the Constitution. So in the Radicalism of the American Revolution, Gordon Wood makes this claim that I'm quoting, by the early 19th century, America had already emerged as the most egalitarian society in history. I think this is true. I think this is uncontestable. And I've been looking for counterexamples for the last 20 years and haven't found it. I think we are the most egalitarian society in history. But unlike Wood, I don't see this as necessarily a good thing. Wood argues throughout the radicalism that the form taken by political equality after the revolution was unexampled in world history. That, of course, does not mean that it has no intellectual roots in the Western intellectual tradition. Wood emphasizes the role of Locke's sensationalism and his reliance on the principle that all human beings are equal in the sight of God, later used by egalitarians like John Adams to fight hierarchy. And there's an anti-Calvinist bias in Adams, which I won't go into. But subsequent studies by Jeremy Waldron, Sarah Mortimer at Oxford, emphasize the theological roots of Locke's thinking and his reliance on radical interpretations of the Bible at odds with traditional mainstream Protestant readings. Sarah Mortimer in particular shows that Locke did not need to be a practicing Socinian to absorb from English political sectarianism of the 17th century the belief that individual consciences should not be forced by the state, which is the ultimate source of the idea of denominationalism, or the idea that the individual conscience formed by reason and a correct reading of Scripture was in a sense sacred, and its understandings and critical insights were necessarily prior to the authority of tradition and established churches. So American egalitarianism has its roots in these radical anti-authoritarian religious traditions, and this is, I suggest, the reason why the politics of equality in America sometimes resemble a religious crusade and ultimately drive it in illiberal directions. It may have begun well, and I think it was actually a revolution in attitudes is definitely necessary after the revolution. We were a different society, different principles, but it can go too far. I think that it may have begun well, but it ended up being a destructive force, an ideological force driving radicalism. So to my mind, it's something like ever closer union in the European Union, European community as it once was. At a certain point, it was very benign. Everyone loved it. It was, making everyone richer through free trade, but then it becomes tyrannical. So I think this is the problem with the American form of radical equality. The abuse doesn't abolish the use, as someone said yesterday, quoting Augustine. But if an ideological engine for radical change is built into the use, you eventually and inevitably end up with the abuse. So the suggestion, 10 minutes? Okay, I'll try to sum up the actual positive part of my paper, which is that I think that America needs to rethink its inherited quasi-religious form of egalitarianism and recover older and sounder ways of thinking about political equality that are rooted in the Western traditions. Like the founders themselves, we should turn to the ancients in the European past for inspiration. Western tradition is not only unique among world civilizations for its long traditions of democracy, republicanism, the rule of law, and citizenship, but also for its ideals of equality. Traditional pre-modern political ideals of equality are not based on ideals of dignity and respect for individuals, ideas themselves based on equality in the sight of God. These ideals are religious ideals that come out of the Christian tradition, but they're first applied to Republican politics only in the 16th century by the radical reformers, especially the Socinians. Pre-modern ideals of equality are quite different. Greek democracy, for example, between the time of Solon in the early 6th century and the time of Pericles in the late 5th, went through a process of radicalization, which is similar in some ways to what happened in America after the Revolution. But the basis of its egalitarianism is very different. Egalitarian ideals in ancient Athens emerged to fight both tyranny and aristocracy like the American egalitarian ideals, but The argument for equality was not only that it prevented arbitrary and unjust rule, but that citizens deserved to be equal because their participation in self-rule educated them in government. Protagoras, the great 5th century theorist of democracy, whom we know principally through Plato's dialogue of that name, taught that man was the measure of all things, and that the gods had given all men an equal measure of justice and of shame. So there is a religious aspect to Greek democracy, and there are even temples established in 5th century Greece celebrating democracy and equality. But the argument for equality is different. Ordinary people, as Protagoras argues, have the capacity to rule themselves. And he argues that through laws and through deliberation in common, a democracy can instill in ordinary citizens enough political virtue to govern themselves. The most powerful argument, of course, for democratic equality was the obligation of all adult males to fight in the city's phalanx or in the navy. Greek democratic equality is based on desert, the equal contribution of citizens to the city's welfare. It's an earned equality, it's not an ascribed equality. I think that's a very important distinction. In the Roman Republic, the type of equality that emerged from the struggle of the orders was also meritocratic. Plebeians and patricians deserved political equality when they made equal contributions to the state, especially in war. That was what entitled them to equality under the law. In Livy's words, the rule of law meant the commands of the laws are more powerful than those of men. They were equally binding on all because they were the result of a republican political process that included all citizens, whose unequal weight in that political process reflected their differential contributions to the state. This is all being theorized by Cicero in the De Legibus on laws based on the old Serbian constitution from the monarchical times. So equality under law consisted in the fact that any citizen could claim his citizen rights to a fair trial. No one was above the law. With the permission of the magistrate, anyone could bring suit against anyone else. Citizen equality under law, however, does not entitle citizens to equal power in the political system, which is why the Romans don't have one man, one vote. Leadership in the community depended on your rank, on dignitas, which is the word dignitas in the pre-modern period means rank or prestige or personal worth. It doesn't mean some kind of innate quality which everyone has in equal measure. So when it comes to government, everybody was not as good as everyone else, and leadership in principle depended on merit and desert. I won't do medieval. If you want to talk about some of these other things, I have a section here on medieval city republics, which is quite interesting because they value work. Work is what qualifies you to have a role in the political system. But I'll talk a little about, just 2 words about the Renaissance, my own field. One thing I've learned about teaching Western Civ is your own field suddenly shrinks in importance. But anyway, among the humanist political thinkers of the Renaissance, this is before Machiavelli, equality is considered instrumental to liberty. You can't have liberty in a society where there are vast disproportions in power and wealth. This article comes from Aristotle. This comes from Aristotle. So equality and an expectation that everyone should engage in work helps to maintain concord. Excluding citizens from office for political reasons makes them bitter and seditious. Equality is also a way of behaving. It's a virtue. Equalitas is considered a virtue in many Renaissance writings. So it's like Suetonius's civilitas. It's knowing how to comport yourself like a citizen, to give and take your just proportion of the public good, the public thing, the res publica, and learning how to rule and be ruled in turn. That's civilitas. That's a virtue, but it's also called aequalitas. All right, so I'm going to skip consent. The Renaissance form of equality is equality in the capacity for virtue, which is the basis of the claim that political legitimacy must be based on moral authority and not on mere heredity or ownership of power or custom or religious authority. I'll wind up. So none of these forms of equality assume the innate, natural, God-given equality of all human beings qua human. None demand that the political system must give me equal rights based on the bare fact of my being human. They're based rather on work, merit, contributions to the republic. The pre-modern form of equality is the product of prudence as well as justice, which means that equality, like liberty, is not an absolute value. It's an ideal goal. It's not an ideal goal without which no polity can be truly just. It's rather a reward for virtue, public spirit, and loyalty to the country. By contrast, the radical American form of egalitarianism, so long as it continues to be a goal of politics, so long as justice is construed as impossible to achieve apart from the achievement of radical socioeconomic and political equality, will have no peace. No justice, no peace, as the protesters like to chant. When the extreme anti-traditional equality of the kind that grew out of the American Revolution is taken as a precondition of justice and freedom, then our politics and social life become too radical to allow in the long run for a stable and flourishing society. Celebrating the sentiment, "I'm as good as you," is not the way to build a cooperative and harmonious society, in my view. If we want to restore sanity and stability to American political life, I would suggest we try to reimagine equality as it was conceived in the older Western tradition. We need to cultivate rather the sentiment that I deserve equal consideration because I've earned it, because of my contributions to the common good.
I want to thank Robbie for the invitation and Brad Wilson for setting things up. And it's a great privilege to be here. I also want to apologize for not being here yesterday. I'm anchored to a course that I am teaching at Hillsdale College at 9 a.m. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, and that has somewhat limited my ability to be here. I will also not be at dinner tonight because I have to catch a plane to get back so I can do the Thursday morning talk. But the question is a fascinating one, and I'm glad it was asked. And it's asked in a way that very few people would think of asking it. Too radical? Come now. I want to go back to an earlier question that's presupposed here, which is that the American Revolution was radical. It's the question that Gordon Wood addresses in his book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. And it is directed, that book, at two different audiences. One, those who think there was no radicalism to the American Revolution, and Gordon shows that they're just plain wrong. But second, it's aimed at the progressive historians who think that the American Revolution was a great social revolution, and very little evidence for that. Came off again, sorry. So let me go back to the question of whether the American Revolution was radical at all. Here's the argument against it. The colonies were self-governing before the revolution. And in fact, the revolution emerges as something reactionary. There is pressure from the authorities in Great Britain to change the situation. And the colonists are defending what they've got. They're not looking for something that they don't have. Technically, the governors are very powerful in the American colonies. In practice, they don't get paid a salary unless the colonial legislatures vote them a salary. So they arrive with all sorts of directions from London about what they're going to do, and then the colonists teach them who's really the boss. Jack Green showed this a long time ago. So the consequence is, take the Stamp Act. Is it oppressive in terms of the level of taxation? No. It's really next to nothing. What's its purpose? It's to raise a revenue so that the governors can be paid directly from London, which will liberate the governors from the legislatures in the various American colonies. What's going on is a revolution from above. And it's being resisted in the colonies because they want to continue governing themselves as they more or less always had. So what do the colonists do? Apart from a nod to John Locke in the first treatise written about all of this at the time, they appeal to the rights of Englishmen. They appeal to tradition. They appeal to law. And who is most behind the resistance? It's the upper class. It's the people whose status depends upon their role in the colonial assemblies and who are going to lose status if those assemblies turn out to be of no significance in the future. So it's a revolution led from above. And there are places in the American colonies where people of a lower class are resistant to the revolution. I have in mind the regulators in the Carolinas who are in the backlands and who can say no taxation without representation because they aren't represented. And they have to go all the way to the coast in order to find justice. So they are rebelling against the very thing that the colonial leadership claims to be rebelling against. And, you know, the ultimate, what turns the resistance into a revolution are the intolerable acts. When the British assert the power to abolish colonial assemblies, to suspend colonial assemblies. And what is done in Massachusetts terrifies the elites in the various colonies. So it's a kind of upper class resistance against modernizers from Great Britain who want more efficient government. They've wanted it for years and years. And the Whig leadership in Great Britain has said, let sleeping dogs lie. And the colonies have grown to be powerful enough that they can really resist. If this had been done in 1720, it probably would have worked. You try it in the 1760s, and it's not so certain it's going to work. The issue is forced by the intolerable acts. The colonists can no longer appeal to the rights of Englishmen, because the only way they're going to remain self-governing is if they cease to be Englishmen. And so they have to find another foundation for a defense of their rights. And by the way, these rights are corporate. They're, in a certain sense, medieval. Each American colony is a kind of medieval corporation and self-governing according to a charter, just as medieval corporations were self-governing due to a charter. They didn't have liberty, they had liberties that were granted by the king. And one sign of the reactionary character of the American resistance is their tendency to appeal to the king over Parliament, which is a denial of the supremacy of king in Parliament established by the Glorious Revolution. Finally, in desperation, they move towards independence. And they have to have another foundation for their claims. And Locke is there. He's been there all along. They've been reading him. But they've not been reading him the way you read someone who is suddenly useful to you. And they come in the 1770s to reread Locke. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it echoes certain passages in the Second Treatise of Government. Long-standing abuses, long train of abuses, that kind of thing. Okay, the minute they move away from the rights of Englishmen to Locke, they have moved from tradition, from corporate rights that have been granted and can't be taken back. At least they think they can't be taken back. From an appeal to law to an appeal to nature. And the minute you make that move, you have to look at yourselves, because you have slaves. And there are slaves in every American colony. They are not vital to the economy in Massachusetts the way they are vital to the economy in Virginia and South Carolina, but they are there. And the justice of slavery is almost unquestioned. It's not really until the 18th century that you get, on any scale, a kind of intellectual, non-religious opposition to slavery. The clearest statement is in Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748. It may be implicit in Locke, but Locke never directly addresses it. And Locke isn't even happy to have his doctrine applied to Ireland. Deeply unhappy when a friend of his applies it to Ireland and even mentions that Locke wrote the two treatises of government, which he didn't want to admit having written. And he only acknowledges it in his will. So when the Americans make this move, they have to rethink everything. And the virtue of Gordon's book is he sets aside largely the question of slavery and asks, what happens to mores and manners in society among white people, basically, as a consequence of this? In other words, even if there had been no slaves in North America, there would have been radicalism. And it takes a certain course. It goes a certain direction. Now look, if you had gone from France to England in the early 18th century, as Voltaire did, as Montesquieu did, you were moving from a very hierarchical world to a very egalitarian world, and you would be struck by the degree, the differences. When American colonists went to England in the middle of the 18th century, they had the same experience, but the reverse of it. They looked at England and they were, in some means, shocked by how hierarchical it was. What Gordon argues in his book is that if somebody from 1830 had been transported back to 1760, they would have been similarly shocked by the hierarchical, deferential character of American society. So yes, it was a radical revolution. It was a different set of principles. And it was not grounded in tradition or in law. It was grounded in nature. And it caused a rethinking. Gordon's book is very good on that. I also recommend to you a book by Thomas West called The Political Theory of the American Revolution. He's one of the few people who's actually looked at changing state laws, in particular at family law and the way it changes, which is quite significant. Everyone here has probably heard of Thomas Jefferson's revisal of the laws of Virginia. Something similar happened in the other colonies, and it's not been much written about. Some years ago, I had to give a talk at one of these things we do for donors at Hillsdale College on the family at the founding and the family today. And I called up a fellow we'd had in our department what he does is history of the family. And I said, what's been written about the family in the age of the American Revolution? And he says, nothing. So I stole Thomas West's unpublished chapter, with his permission, and based it on that. But there is more to be said about this if you look at the changing laws in the first 20 or 30 years after the Revolution, if you look at state law. The other things that are involved are really quite radical. One is the end to tutelage. Every one of the colonies except Pennsylvania and maybe Delaware was a confessional state before the Revolution. By 1820, none of the states are confessional states. And it happens very quickly in most places. Massachusetts is exceptional in that particular regard. The principle of freedom of religion that is in the First Amendment becomes a principle that is essentially adopted state by state. That's extraordinarily important. If you go back before 1787, virtually every state in the world is a confessional state, and they always have been. The Roman Empire, ancient Athens, ancient Sparta, obviously medieval Europe, the world of Islam, both Sunni and Shiite. To drop the confessional state is an astonishing event. The best that you could have, the most that you could have hoped for before that was toleration. And toleration is not the same thing as religious freedom. It literally is, I'll put up with you. It's something different. The other thing is you begin emancipation in the wake of the Revolution, where it is easy to carry out bit by bit between 1776 and 1840. You get an abolition of slavery. Where it is not easy to carry out, there is some emancipation, and then it grinds to a halt. And gradually, we end up with two countries. One country based on the first few sentences in the Declaration of Independence, and another country based on something else. And interestingly enough, we have a tendency to think race is everything. But if you look at at Reconstruction and look at the debates in Congress, they're less about slavery than about the consequences of slavery. And the consequences of slavery are oligarchy. There's a wonderful recent book by a fellow named Forrest Neighbors. And what Forrest shows is all of the arguments that take place in the Reconstruction Congresses, among the radical Republicans dominating, have to do with republicanism. And the implication of those arguments is there is no republicanism in the South. What there is oligarchical domination. And it's true. You couldn't be a member of the South Carolina legislature without being a slave owner. That was by law. Elsewhere in the South, almost no one is elected to state legislatures who isn't a slave owner. It really is a slave owner oligarchy. So, in some sense, the American Civil War is not over until slavery is abolished. And in that sense, it's socially radical. It just takes a long, long time. Eventually, of course, women get the vote. The unfolding logic that's implicit. All men are created equal, which does not mean all males are created equal. No one ever thought that. So changes occur that are inspired by the decision made when they embraced Locke and natural rights. And that experiment is now under siege. I believe what we're seeing in this country now is actually a rejection of everything that I've just laid out. But my time is limited, and I have another shot at you later this afternoon where I'm supposed to talk about the present discontents. So I won't talk about the present discontents. Let me end by saying that when I saw Emeritus after Darren's name, I thought, oh my God, if he's Emeritus, I'm Methuselah. Then I came here and I was relieved. First I saw Michael Zucker and I thought, and then I saw Gordon Wood. And Gordon Wood looks as good as he looked 20 years ago. You really can't tell the difference. And out in the audience is Alan Kors. Suddenly I feel young and frisky again. Darren.
Well, thank you for that intro, Paul. And I obviously thank to Robbie and Brad and the whole JMP family, as I call it, because it is a family. And also thanks for, I guess it was Professor Hankins who thought of this wonderful panel. As an early Americanist, and maybe the only other, oh, I'm sorry. As an early Americanist, and maybe one of the few ones here, it's a distinct pleasure to speak of really the greatest living early Americanist in the world. And that's not a small thing to say. And this is a book, like many others that Professor Wood has written, that revolutionized the field. And that whether one agrees with it or not, has really profoundly influenced the way people have thought about not only the revolution and not only the founding, but the trajectory of the American political, social, and cultural experience. So this is really a joy for me to have anything to say about this topic and about this remarkable work. My predecessors have talked about specific or focused on critical themes in the work. Professor Hankins on the problem of egalitarianism. I think in some way, Professor Rahe has been talking about the roots of our ideas of liberty, from corporate privileges to natural rights. I want to turn to what might be the sort of third leg of this stool. But first, let me, because I'm going to try to be very brief, I'll give you the very short answer to the question, was the American Revolution too radical? And that is maybe. We'll see soon. The American Revolution was, by any reasonable standard, a radical affair. Sundering the tie with monarchy not only required a transformation of political institutions, it also eradicated much of the political culture which had been based on patronage and clientage and place within a hierarchical rank. A similar transformation occurred within society as traditional markers of gentility and deference gave way, I should say, and forms of bondage were either undermined or discarded entirely. Revolution accelerated the commercialization of American society by easing entry into the transactive economy. All of these changes were radical, but I believe none were too radical. But the most radical of all the changes wrought by the American Revolution is the one that Professor Wood identified with such force and clarity and has done so for so many years, namely the democratic transformation of America's self-understanding. Americans came to see themselves and their regime as democratic by the early 19th century at the latest. And it is this radical change, I fear, that may yet prove to be a bit too radical for the health of the regime that the revolution created. So let me briefly dispense with those other forms of radicalism. Breaking from the British Empire thrust Americans into a vast political unknown. New modeling constitutions from scratch had ever proved a perilous task, even more so without the mooring of monarchy and its stabilizing cultural underpinnings. And was hardly to be expected that some of the first forays after independence would prove unworkable. Almost everywhere, executives were too weak to govern, legislatures too large and frequent to be judicious, and notions of constitutional construction and promulgation severely underdeveloped. Certainly, some of these constitutions were too radical or too radically, quote, popular to afford political stability, especially some of the unicameral schemes like in Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Georgia. Yet in time, lessons of prudence were drawn from experience, and most states restructured their governments along the lines laid out in our federal frame, one whose bicameral legislature, independent judiciary, and unitary executive armed with full pardon and patronage powers bears many of the markers of both the British and colonial governments. The resultant formally mixed republic, replete with separation of powers and ample checks and balances to assure the rule of law and the rights and liberties of the individual citizen. Given that result, one is hardly pressed to see this transformation as too radical. Similarly, sundering what Jefferson called the bonds which tied one people to another resulted in the eradication of many forms of the social bonds that had hitherto been taken for granted. The fact that much of the very apex of the colonial elite were at best lukewarm in their patriotism, and at worst loyalists, surely accelerated the decline of social deference and rank. So too came a rejection of social dependence and its own old formula of protection and allegiance. The Revolution put a fairly abrupt end to the use of bound labor and indentured servitude among the free population, and unleashed what Professor Wood has rightly noted as, quote, the first anti-slavery movement in the history of the world. By the time this first wave of emancipation had run its course in the early 19th century, slavery had been put on the course of extinction in the Old Northwest and 8 of the original 13 states. These were certainly radical changes, but they were salutary rather than destabilizing. The end of indentures gave way almost seamlessly to wage contracts as the commercialization of the economy accelerated, creating a more mobile and nimble labor market. And at least in some cases, the emancipation of the enslaved was so gradual, and alas, that was the case here in New Jersey, that one can't help wishing it had been a bit more radical. Even the decline of deference was not as destructive as often imagined. Deference had, after all, always been a little bit tenuous in those colonies that lacked steep hierarchies of dependence. And in many cases, the Revolution simply transferred political deference from one group, a landed gentry who enjoyed odium, to another, lawyers. The Revolution brought with it the routinization of incorporation and banking and eventually bankruptcy relief, all of which laid the tracks for an acceleration of the commercialization of the American economy. These changes not only eased entry into transactive activity for the common man, those common men also benefited from the opening of vast tracts of land in the Western territories, as well as newly available acres seized from loyalists. These dramatic changes have been widely chronicled, and by none better than Dr. Wood in this book. But perhaps the best indice of how radical this change was cultural. Before the Revolution, the ambition of many a young man was to establish what was called a competency. Enough land and farming stock to raise a family in something like self-sufficiency. This was the goal. By the time the commercial side of the Revolution had run its course, the persistence of a desire for competency was a sign of regional backwardness, poverty, and a throwback to a more primitive stage of agriculture. Assuredly radical, but just as assuredly not too radical. Then I want to turn to the crux, the question of democracy. At first, the rise of, quote, democracy in America seems a largely harmless affair, albeit theoretically bold. And it is important to remember that in the 18th century, to ascribe someone's beliefs as democratic were fighting words. It was a decidedly negative description. The propensity for citizens of our republic to describe the regime as, quote, democratic and its society as, quote, egalitarian is, after all, merely a matter of words, since it does refer to the same political architecture that was previously styled Republican. Indeed, despite the emergence of Democratic office holding, the real thrust of this democratic awakening, as Professor Wood has demonstrated, was in mores rather than modes of governance, expressing a sense of bounding social mobility and open cultural, economic, and geographical vistas. This was indeed a radical transformation, for democracy had a very specific and negative meaning in the late 18th century, and its transition into not only a term of approbation, but perhaps the highest desideratum and unifying principle in the political culture afforded a new basis for solidarities. The appeal to democracy and the people was a rhetorical source of unity that more than compensated for the loss of king and country, and meant that appeals for political support had to be, in theory at least, grounded in that which would promote pursuits of happiness and security. There have been at least 3 problems arising from this radical transformation. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, at least to foreign observers like Tocqueville, was cultural. He observed what we might call the emergence of a democratic principle of taste and opinion. Tocqueville saw this in the propensity of democratic Americans to stay within the public consensus on matters not merely political, but religious and philosophical as well, a commitment to what he saw as a narrow utilitarianism and conventionality. He also saw it in the replacement of intellectual and aesthetic excellence and distinction with middle-brow sentimentality and boosterism. Now, there is no doubt some truth to this, probably due to commercialization as much as democracy, as popular entertainment has then and now it continues to garner so much more attention and so many more resources than the, quote, more highbrow productions associated with genius. One can't help think of the utter obscurity of Herman Melville, particularly his later works, and contrast it with the great success and contemporary critical acclaim of lesser literary lights like Mark Twain and Walt Whitman. If he'd written about anything besides democracy, we would never have heard of him. Real American thing. On the other hand, as Edward Chills was fond of reminding us, all cultures produce high and low. And in that sense, American culture, popular culture, is actually among the most sophisticated and artful of its kind in the world, and always has been. Nor do we lack luminary works of genius. If they are not as heralded as they ought be, is that due to our democratic tastes, or the democratic tastes of our middle classes, or the aesthetic and critical blind spots of our educated betters in the Academy and the Republic of Letters? The second problem with our democratic radicalism is the violence it does to political language and discourse. To see the American regime as democratic requires one to squint one's vision so as to blur out the blaring contradictions. And there are no shortage of contradictions from the decidedly non-majoritarian Senate and Electoral College to the utterly anti-popular federal judiciary. If democracy is the rule of the majority, according to the principle of vox populi, vox dei, what can possibly be the point of checks and balances but to stand in the way of progress? Hence, those who have invoked the principle in political speech have either ignored the contradictions or defined the term in such an anodyne and vague way that it is shorn of any signification other than the transmission of a warm feeling of approval. Consider one of our greatest democratic leaders, President Franklin Roosevelt, who defined democracy in the Commonwealth Address as a quest, a never-ending seeking for better things. I mean, who can oppose that? But someone mentioned apple pie and mother yesterday. That's pretty close. Certainly there is nothing malign in such a vague blandness, but it does rob us of any hope of analytic clarity in discussion of constitutional rights and limits. And precisely because it is such a sacred honorific, its invocation can, on the one hand, positively master vast forces of voluntary and eager compliance for a given set of policies, but just as quickly lead us to utter disillusionment and cynicism if those policies fail to deliver and that invocation rings hollow. I'll cite just one example among many. Consider Woodrow Wilson's call to arms in 1917 as a war to keep the world safe for democracy. Few appeals in American history have had such a dramatic and galvanizing effect. Few also have resulted in a more devastating withdrawal after it became clear that the world was no safer for or more democratic than before. It just had a lot less people in it. There is no doubt a tension here between the good that the honorific democracy can do in rallying the public in a time of trouble, but also the abuse of that term that can be equally destructive. The third danger of this form of radicalism, of the use of democracy to describe our way of politically being, is the possibility that avowed public champions of democracy may use its majoritarian principle to undermine our constitutional fabric. Perhaps the most famous Democrat in our history, Andrew Jackson, reputedly replied to the Supreme Court's judgment in Worcester v. Georgia that John Marshall has spoken, let him enforce his order. Of course, the order was not enforced. An Indian removal and the consequent trail of tears ensued, to the great shame of this nation ever since. Yet Jackson's decision was democratic, if not Republican, and popular. The Indian Removal Act had been duly passed by elected representatives and probably reflected a significantly large majority opinion. What right had unelected jurists to intercede against the will of the people? Such majoritarian urges would not end with the founder of the party that self-consciously identified itself as the democracy. The great FDR himself tried his hand at court packing, a possibility our current president has recently considered. Nor is this democratic radicalism restricted in its danger to the rule of law through assaults on unelected judges. Popular violence and riotous behavior has all too often been legitimated by popular democratic leaders, justified as the people out of doors expressing something called their voices. It was the volume and frequency of such vocal expression that drove a young Abraham Lincoln to give his Lyceum address, recognizing in the expression of those voices a clear democratic threat to the Republican rule of law and security of individual rights. Of course, the greatest danger is when the language of democracy is both debased into meaningless abstraction and then deployed to pursue immediate political advantage. That is to say, when the word democracy retains its full sacred power, but is entirely abstracted from the procedures and constraints of our system of laws and constitutional government. In that circumstance, it can become a weapon to undermine those constraints and that very system of laws. I don't know that that's happened yet, but that, I think, is the danger. We have already become used to the call for the elimination of the Electoral College as undemocratic, and surely the Senate is not far behind, although for now, the democracy has settled for threatening to create new states until a more desirable and democratic balance is assured. We have also learned that unrestricted speech is a threat to our democracy, that disagreement about certain contentious issues is an act of violence, and that the First Amendment should never be construed to afford a platform for the expression of beliefs that make protected right bearers feel unsafe or unwelcome in our democratic order. Perhaps these are merely fringe phenomena that will pass, but it is troubling to learn that our federal government has labored to monitor and suppress the expression of citizens guilty of malinformation, misinformation, disinformation, and even incorrectly contextualized true information, all in the name of defending democracy. As the term democracy increasingly becomes a cudgel to bludgeon the rights and liberty of dissenting individual citizens, our linguistic imprecision around this amorphous honorific can be used to justify almost any neologistic absurdity. Democratic equality before the law is replaced with equity. Respect for individual and cultural difference and exchange morphs into a cult of diversity with an ominously eugenic ring. And freedom of association gives way to a program of inclusion that issues in segregated affinity spaces. Words come to mean less and do more. Just recently, we established an Office of Climate Justice. I look forward to joining a class action suit against the environment when my purchase of an expensive Tesla and heat pump is not matched by cooler summers. To be sure, it's not merely the language of democracy that has produced these anomalous and rather frightening developments. Political polarization, a fractured media environment, and a sense of never-ending emergency and crisis have enabled the worst behaviors by all parties. Yet it has played a part in lowering the reach of our political discourse and leveling our appreciation of the variety of goods and desiderata that are part of any healthy political order, especially one as large, powerful, and variegated as our own. Perhaps these threats will dissipate as the sense of crisis and rage pass. But until it does, we cannot help fearing that this part of the revolution's legacy may, after all, prove to be too radical ultimately.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And now we have some time for audience questions.
Thank you, Alan Gibson from the Kinder Institute at University of Missouri. So I want, this is an observation. I'm looking for a comment, and it's kind of prompted by Darren's comments about democracy, extensive his extensive discussion of democracy. Anyway, early in his career, Professor Wood wrote an essay, I think it was shortly after the creation of the American Republic, called The Democratization of the Mind in the American Revolution, which I consider as an absolute classic. Short essay summarizing a lot of things that are going to come later in his scholarship. At the end of that essay, he designates the idea of the formation of public opinion as the way that democracy is going to be delivered in America as a central event in the democratization of the mind of the American Revolution. Popular sovereignty in itself can be extremely elitist. I mean, even the Declaration says, you can have the right to revolution, but then you form a kind of government that you want, and it can be, he doesn't say anything and be agnostic as to the form in at least that passage there. But anyway, the point of this is just basically that if you're looking for something that's really radical about the American Revolution, is it the concept of public opinion, the formation of it, and the way that we're going to deliver democracy in America, or popular sovereignty rather, is through public opinion. I would just point out and add to that it's an amorphous concept as well. It's very protean, and it's presented at a time when it can't be measured, which is very advantageous to a lot of different people, evoking it because they don't have to point to public opinion polls or anything like that. Anyway, if you're looking for something that's most radical about the American Revolution, I would nominate that, and I'm just looking for your reaction.
There's an understandably little-known essay by David Hume on the true basis of government, and he argued that every government in the world is ultimately based on public opinion. That no government, he didn't live to see the Maxim gun in the late 19th century, but that no government had the ability to fully enforce its will if the vast majority of the society resisted. But that is, I think you're right, Alan. It's different from explicitly saying that not only should public opinion be ultimately a check on how far you can go, but should be the way to actually guide society. And I do think that is radical. I don't think that's not salutary. I think part of what the genius of the adjustment and constitutions in the 1780s achieved was to say you cannot govern without consent of the governed, but you cannot govern entirely based on vox populi, vox dei. You need to somehow find a balance there. And I think most Americans know that instinctually, but when you're having a fight with your political opponents and you find the cudgel of saying your dissent is standing in the way of my agenda, it's awfully tempting to just forget about those checks and balances. And I mean, we've gotten past it before, and hopefully we will again, but I sense there's a lot of people who are frustrated by it, would like to dispense with those checks and balances and impose their will.
Tocqueville, when he talks about the tyranny of the majority, is talking about what you're referring to, public opinion. And, it's an interesting business. In a place like England, even today, it's easier to champion lost causes and forsaken beliefs than it is in the United States.
Thank you. Will Hay from Mississippi State University. An observation, talking about the radicalism of the American Revolution and the radicalism of the present moment. I recall around the time that John Bowles' Jefferson biography came out, a wave of commentary about the Loyalists were right. If only the revolution had not been won, we would not have had the Jacksonian moment, the Jeffersonian moment, and we could have been Canada. So I'd be curious to get the panels. We could have been Canada. Not the old Canada, but the post-Trudeau, the elder Trudeau Canada. But I'd be curious to get the panel's thought on this, on how is it that we see among writers in the New Republic and the people obsessed with the current thing, this turn against, not only against the radicalism of the American founding or against the American founding, but it's an odd embrace of a kind of loyalism that didn't really exist because it would have been a regulated, managed state. And so I'd be interested to see how that fits with some of these discussions.
Well, one of the problems is the American population was growing at such a rate that America was going to have greater weight than Great Britain. And it wasn't too far in the future, a couple generations. And there were people in Britain who saw this. One of the reasons to rein in the colonies is the fear that these semi-independent colonies would be dictating to the mother country. I think that would have happened.
I think actually Franklin obliquely threatens such a thing in his essay on population.
Yeah, Ben Franklin's the guy who sees it clearly.
Amanda Green.
Hi, Amanda Green, University of California, Santa Barbara. Thank you all. I want to ask you to comment on the relationship between radicalism and realism. So the way that I understood some of the remarks from Professor Hankins was that there's a version of thinking about equality which incorporates a kind of realism, or at least this is the way I would read Burke, incorporates a kind of realism about how much we can change human nature in order to eliminate the kinds of social inequalities that radicals object to. And my impression, having taught students democratic theory for 10 years now, is that I used to have to persuade them to be less radical, whereas now they're all realists. The problem is not that they're radicals. And what I mean by that is not that they aren't interested in eliminating certain forms of social injustice, but that they are skeptical about the masses, about the democratic masses' ability to exercise good judgment. And this I worry about because it leaves them with the alternative of empowering certain elites. But at any rate, it seems to me that radicalism can be contrasted with realism in certain ways, but it can also be combined with realism in certain ways. And so I'd love to invite your comments on how you see that working today, but also in the history of ideas about equality, especially from Professor Hankins. So my impression is that students are willing to think about equality in lots of different ways, as you were suggesting that we encourage them to do, but that they're still wedded to a kind of realism about whether democracy is going to be, how much they can trust, I guess, democratic decision-making. Let's put it that way.
Very interesting question. Thank you. I haven't really considered it from quite that point of view. What I was trying to do is to recover an older way of thinking about political equality, which is not based on a kind of religious conception of the human person, but is based on the way that individuals relate to their community. So this is, to me, an inherently prudential process. It's a question of practical wisdom. I'm not sure realism is the right word for it, but practical wisdom, I guess, is always going to be realist in some sense, because it's based on things like the history of the community, the level of virtue of the community, how much equality can be given is a realist issue. So the famous example that they loved in the Renaissance was the Romans and the Cappadocians. Right? So the Romans conquer Asia Minor, and they're given help by the Cappadocian people. So they say to them, "We want to reward you with political freedom." And the Cappadocians say, No, we have no experience of, we've always had a monarch. Give us a monarch. And the Romans can't understand this because they think, this is during the Republic, they think that having a freedom is what you would want. But the story is told so as to show that freedom, equality, these fundamental notions of republics are not universal, or they're not universal. They're proportionate. They are related to the society that you're in. So perhaps this isn't what you're asking about, but I think this is a very important point about pre-modern political values, that they're rarely absolute. Even the desire for liberty is always conditioned. Leonardo Bruni, one of the great historians of the Renaissance, said, "All peoples desire freedom, but not all are capable of it." Sometimes people lose the ability to exercise freedom, and they have to be taught it again. It's a famous example when the Lucchese, which was a republic in the 14th century, came under the control of the tyrant. A couple of generations, the Florentines kicked out the tyrant, and then they say, we have to teach the Lucchese people, and the people of Lucca, famously celebrated by Hobbes, right? We have to teach them how to be free again, how to be equal again, because they've lost all of these instincts. So, again, it's a way of thinking that's not based on the idea that everyone should be equal and must be treated as equal by the political system. The political system has, in a way, to force equality on the people, and that's the only right way to do things. It's a more prudential style of thinking. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but...
I have one comment. This conference is in part dedicated to the memory of Angelo Codevilla. You might look at his book on oligarchy, because he's became convinced towards the end of his life that this country was moving very rapidly in the direction of oligarchy. That is to say, ruled by those who believe that they are wise over the fools. And that may be your students.
Thank you, Jim Stoner, LSU. I've always read Professor Wood's book, Radicalism of the American Revolution, as suggesting that monarchy and democracy are sort of stable social states, but republicanism was this unstable ideology that, in a way, the founders had to appeal to in order to separate from England, solve their political problem, but that led them inevitably towards democracy. And yet, and this is prompted by Professor Staloff's remarks, is that distinction between democracy and republic, which was dominant at the founding and still persists in the names of our political parties, is it a distinction that is still viable for those who want to resist radical democratization today? Or can we not appeal to republicanism? I realize the danger of an appeal. Professor Hank, I mean, we have two of the leading historians of republicanism on this panel, right? Professor Hankins, though, in saying that equality has to be earned, of course, that's the principle of inequality, right? Because someone might earn it more than another, and republicanism, I suppose, allowed for that. Can we still make an argument confidently for republicanism as what America stands for, or do we have to say democracy or some kind of qualification of democracy today?
Well, I certainly hope we can still defend republicanism, since that is our Constitution. It's a Republican Constitution, and it was designed in part with great knowledge, actually, of the Western tradition. Adams, I've looked at Adams' papers and books in the Boston Public Library. This man really knew a lot. He knew everything that could possibly be known in this period in America about the history of Western democracy and republicanism. He wasn't a big fan of democracy, but more of republicanism. And the lesson that many people took from the tradition was that we needed a mixed regime. We needed a mixed constitution, and that's what I believe the Constitution is designed to provide. Mixed constitutions were regarded as more stable than democracies. Democracy is thought to be unstable. So, in fact, any regime that's based on a single class is going to be unstable, and the reason why you have the democratic element in the House of Representatives, and you have an element that's supposed to be more meritocratic in the Senate and in the Electoral College. It's supposed to be wise men who can step in and moderate the passions of the many. That's mixed regime. That's an Aristotelian principle, as filtered, I would say, through Renaissance constitutionalism. So I don't regard personally the Republican state as one that's inherently unstable. I think it's the only hope for stability, in fact, and that a balance of classes and the judicious application of wise magistrates, the judicious rule of wise magistrates, and the teaching of virtue in schools, which is also part of the constitutional vision.
If I could add to that, since I sort of opened this can of worms, I do think, I don't know if it'd be easy to recover the meaning of republicanism or republic as opposed to a democracy. And insofar as those words are used interchangeably, I don't know that there would be great harm to it. What I first started getting worried about this teaching courses in the American Revolution, when students, and my students may be freaky because they're often immigrants, would always ask me, how come the Founding Fathers, who seemed to be so smart in your classes, were so stupid to not get that the Electoral College and the Senate just aren't democratic? And then it takes a while to explain that was not the bug, that was the feature. And so I think part of the challenge, Jim, is that we have to have the rhetorical courage to respond in kind to the glibness that's thrown at us. So when we are told that checks and balances is a stodgy way to defend plutocratic elites and that democracy is again, a quest, a never-ending seeking for better things, we have to have the compunction to say, no, quite specifically, what we mean by republic is the rule of law, at least according to Mr. Adams, a system that will ensure the rule of law and individual liberty, and that the majoritarian principle of democracy can be quite often, and I think historically has been, analogized to two wolves and a sheep sitting down to discuss what's for dinner. And if we don't have the courage to say that, you're going to be dinner.
Another way of looking at it is democracy is about popular will, and ultimately, and it was intended from the beginning, that the people rule. Republicanism is about deliberation. And the structure of the government, bicameralism, for example, contributes to double deliberation. The presidential veto plays a role in deliberation. And the point of it is rationality. And popular will, at least in the short run, is not always rational. And the notion was popular will could be checked to some extent, delayed for the sake of deliberation.
Okay, I see we have many more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time for this session. So I just remind you that we will adjourn for half an hour and meet back in this room at 11:15, and then ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.
Well, I think the three of us